Hello everyone, my name is Ellen Jones and I'm the editor at Smiley Movement. I want to take a moment to welcome you to our final SmileyTalks Education event of the year, which has a sort of festive theme to it. We'll be asking a big question. If education is a gift, what should the present look like? This is our 5th education event hosted in partnership with our SmileyTalks Education ambassador, Ray Snape. Before I hand you over to Ray, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Smiley Movement and what we do. Smiley Movement is a non-profit that aims to tackle the big issues in society by matching people and organisations who can help solve problems with others who need solutions. We want to make it as simple as possible for anybody, anywhere, to start creating a positive impact on the world via our unique social network. It's really easy to get involved. Just head to our website, smileymovement.org. And now I'm going to hand you over to Ray Snape. If you have any questions for Ray or our panelists during the event, comment them down below and I'll be back at the end to ask them. And so, Ray, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you so much, Ellen. I am so excited. As you said, today has got a bit of a Christmassy theme, and it is great to see that Liz has got her Christmas tree up behind her. Mackenzie, you've got something that looks like a little Christmas tree behind her. Very little. And in the corner, you can see the marvelous smiley face with a Christmas hat on. So our theme today is, just to repeat what Ellen has said, if education is a gift for our young people to take into the future, what should the present look like? And I am absolutely delighted to be joined today by 3 fantastic people working in the education space. So I've done a quick look, a quick bit of research. And so I hope you don't mind, ladies. I'm going to try to introduce you. If I miss anything out, please feel free to set me right. I'm going to start with wonderful Liz, also known as Lizzie Robinson, if you follow her on Twitter. And Lizzie Robinson was one of the youngest, or the youngest, head teachers at just 29 years of age. She went through...
Just last week.
Just last week. Yes, looking good on it. You went through the Teach First program, and you also
Fast Track, not Teach First. It was before Teach First existed. Yeah. Not that I would be insulted to have been through Teach First, but I wasn't.
I did say set me right. Went through Fast Track and was the head teacher of Surrey Square for 13 years. But now you are working on a big leadership adventure. And these are the words that I found fabulous. So the aim of the big leadership adventure is that you want to train leaders as change makers and disruptors in order that we can support teachers and communities to do what is best for young people. So I'm really thrilled to be joined with somebody who leads with such great values and such great vision. Priya Likhani, OBE, you are the founder of the award-winning AI education technology company called Century, previously a barrister. You left your career to launch a successful business providing millions of meals to people, and also 35,000 vaccinations to the underprivileged. You are also the author of this brilliant book, Inadequate, and it is a fabulous read, and we will get on to that because I thoroughly enjoyed it. And I'm also really delighted to welcome Mackenzie Kerry, who is a co-founder of Gradin. What is really brilliant about Gradin is that your coaching culture is one that works on great gentleness, but persistence, and you are really driven to work with educators and teachers and young people to help them to find their purpose and to make a positive impact on the world. I hope that is a good enough introduction to 3 fantastic people. Now what I'd like to do is to start off with our first question. And I'm shaping this conversation today around, we talked about the future, the present, past, present, and future. And I'm just wondering what it was from your own educational experience, working, being a pupil or a student in school, teachers that may have inspired you, something that has brought you to be who you are today, that you could reflect back and say, that past has brought me into my present. And I'm just thinking that, who would like to explore that first question? Otherwise, I'm going to choose somebody. Mackenzie, can I call on you?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so I think one of the questions that people often ask themselves is who was that educator that made such a huge impact in their life, or who were those many educators? And I have an education experience that was actually quite challenging. So I kind of answer that question differently. For me, I had a different experience in that I remember more than anything the teachers that told me that if I asked one more question, I was going to go to detention. And I remember being the girl who sat in the back of the classroom, who was doing leg lifts and who was doing crunches. Whoever knew that you could do that in class? Whilst I was in maths or whilst I was in history class. And I was in an environment whereby adults didn't know that I had an eating disorder, that I was deeply struggling, that I was a great student because I learned from my experience of being told not to ask questions. I learned how to memorize by rote. Like I learned how to memorize and regurgitate. But what I was very much lacking was my ability to be able to manage my own stresses and my own insecurities and my fears, and to just manage everything that I was feeling throughout my academic years. And so for me, what that did is, and I guess differently than myself, my co-founders had an amazing experience in education where, they need 10 fingers to be able to list the teachers that made a huge impact on them and then inspired them to be themselves. My co-founders, they actually went to a school whereby the motto was, girls can do anything. And that was embedded and instilled within the culture. And so for me, what that meant was that my personal experience has deeply inspired my passion for education. And it's highlighted for me the real value around and the importance of social and emotional learning, supporting young people to be able to support themselves, and supporting teachers to do the same.
That's so beautiful, and no doubt there's something about the social and emotional that feeds into your work today. Priya, something from your past, your actual experience of education, and maybe how it's framing your work today?
Yeah, sure. So similar to Mackenzie in that sense that I had an education that is probably not the best sort of role model story that you want for every child, and I struggled, but actually a really different experience. So I come from an East African Indian family, so I have parents where, and many people recognize this, where education was all that mattered. They gave up a lot in life to ensure that they could that they could make sure that we had the best education as their children. And so when we came home, it was often about, how was school? And if you get 99%, it's like, what happened to the other percent? That sort of conversation, which is different to what we try and instill in people's minds today, is to don't worry about the extra percent. It's about the effort. It wasn't really about that. It was about, why didn't you get 100%? This is all that matters. You must become a doctor, a lawyer, an accountant, the typical kind of like Asian parent. What do you mean you're not good at maths? It's in our blood, kind of all of this stuff. And but when you grow up with that every single day, it's actually quite an enormous amount of pressure to put on a child. And then at school, at a very young age in primary school, I was always very keen. I remember being very keen. I was always very diligent. I really wanted to please my teachers. There's a very Hindu, it's not really even an expression, it's a belief that you give a lot of respect to your teachers. In fact, more than you do to your parents. It's a very, very strong attitude, and that Hindus try and bring their children up with. So I was always taught my teachers are basically like God. I mean, that is literally what they would say. And so I was very diligent, but my results weren't necessarily what everyone wanted at a young age. And then actually I went to a grammar school. I got into a grammar school that everyone was really pleased about, But there I had a couple of teachers who, you know, I said I wanted to be a barrister. That's what I wanted to become when I was older. And there were really good reasons and really fundamental reasons why I wanted to get into the law. And they were potentially, perhaps they were naive, but, you know, my summers and winters in East Africa taught me I wanted to change the world in a positive way. And when you're growing up, you think ethics and justice equals law, you know. And so, but I was told by my teachers, I wish I'd gone to the sort of school that Mackenzie's colleagues did, but actually it was, you're never going to be a barrister, you're female, you're from an ethnic minority, you're not smart enough to go to Oxbridge, it's never going to happen. You know, and so it was actually really, really difficult. And also going home to your parents and saying, no, they've said no, that's never going to happen for me, is not easy when your East African Indian parents on one hand are saying it must happen, and on the other hand you're at school and these teachers who you really respect. And in a sense, the relationship was quite different, I think, to what my kids have with their teachers at school now. There was a bit, well, not quite fear, I would say, but the way in which you dealt with the teachers in my generation is certainly very different to the way that my kids are with their teachers today. So that had a massive impact. But there were two teachers in particular, and actually I've dedicated my book to them. So Mrs. Searle was my chemistry teacher. I was really passionate about chemistry and physics. I had Miss Delves, who I've not been able to find. So if anyone listening knows where Miss Delves is from Oxford Girls Grammar in 1997, please tell her that I need to find her and thank her. But those two teachers took me aside, and I remember this was not in front of everyone else, and they both said at different times, you know, you can really achieve whatever you set your mind to, you know, and it's really about hard work. It's about continuing with what you're doing, and you just need a bit of time, but you need to persevere. And so, and I'll never forget exactly where I was as in uniform. The lawn was over here. I remember where Mrs. Searle was, and I remember where Miss Dells was, and we all have those moments, don't we, where we can picture it. You know, we could paint the scene as though it was literally yesterday. And they had a profound impact on my life. Mrs. Searle opened up the chemistry lab for me every lunchtime so that I was in the middle tier in chemistry, in the sciences. And in the middle tier, it was very difficult to get an A at GCSE. To get an A, basically, you had to, it was just what the threshold was, it was quite high. And I got the A's, and I managed to. But the only reason I got those A's, and it was very important to my family, I did well in the sciences for whatever reason, was because she opened up the lab so that I could get really amazing coursework grades and I could work hard on that. And that's, she went over and above. And there are these teachers that, you know, will always do that. And there are so many of them. So they've had a profound impact in my life. How has that affected what I do today? Well, you know, what I do today, okay, yes, I run a technology company, but actually, you know, Century is very much focused on exactly the question that you're asking today, which is, if it's a gift, then what should that look like? And it is, what can technology provide? What are its limits? But at the same time, it's, you know, what else should we be asking for? Hence the book, you know, what should we be criticizing that still exists? And so my education experience in a sense is shaped, well, okay, I know what doesn't work and I know what can work. But it's today, I think it's very much about listening to current practitioners, because what I do know that I didn't know before was what teachers do, you know, how hard they work. They don't go home at 3:30. And so, I mean, you know, yeah, so a really varied experience at school level, an amazing experience at A level, and then on to further education, you know, higher education. But it's all, as they say in tech, everything, you've got to be agile, you know, you've got to iterate. Every experience shapes the next. You've got to be open to challenge and feedback, to ensure that something as important as education can be provided in the right way today and ongoing to the kids who are going to basically graduate in 2030.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you very much, Priya. And Liz, your experiences of school and how they've impacted on how you are today and your thoughts today?
Well, I think what's really striking for me is my experience of the role that the family plays, really. And I think that was very formative in shaping my work as an educator going forward. So I was brought up in a very sort of left-wing household with a real sense of sort of social justice and public service, and with two parents as social workers. And they fought for me and they pushed me. And when I look back, I mean, I've got all my sort of, you know, workbooks from when I was at primary school. And basically the level I was at compared to what kids in our schools now who are from significantly disadvantaged backgrounds, which I was not, although we were, you know, not privileged particularly, but the level is so much lower. And that is so I think there's something really interesting about that. Was in the 70s and early 80s, I was at primary school, and the standards were just so much lower. So that really I find really interesting from a sort of historical education point of view. But like Priya, my parent, I mean, my dad's a Jewish immigrant and had some of the same sort of immigrant pressures on achievement or high aspirations, another way of looking at it. Got into a grammar school, went to grammar school, and just sort of saw the difference in trajectory that made. And that was a sort of pretty high pressure environment, and did what it says on the tin, which is a grammar school education, and did well and got into Rusbrook University and all the rest of it. But I think the sort of I could see that was happening. So a sort of historic view is seeing actually how little rigor there was, particularly in primary education at that time. And there were good things about it, but there was quite a lot that wasn't that good about it. So it was open-ended, but without the kind of rigor wrapped around it and the sense of progression. And if I hadn't had parents supporting me and pushing me through that primary experience, I wouldn't have got into the grammar school. And then that sort of sense that I felt at the time, I mean, I've got a tree behind me, but the sort of branching of my life direction compared to people who didn't go to the grammar school, I could just sort of see it and feel it, and that that's a sort of privileged position for me, in the sense that my life went in that direction. But I was aware at the time of how unfair that was and how uncomfortable I was about it to some degree.
I'm noticing that both you, Liz, and Priya, you've both talked about the word pressure. And I mean, pressure, and I guess indirectly, I mean, Mackenzie, you were talking about the social emotional side of education. It does affect us, so it does affect children. I'm just now curious about the pressure that young people are experiencing, the pressure that teachers are experiencing. Have we got the system right in the present? Is there too much pressure? Back to you, Mackenzie. You're working with lots of teachers and young people.
Yeah.
Do we think, have we got it right at the moment?
Okay, so there's 2 points to that question. The first one makes me think about an educator that we work with. And she was sharing with us that recently her students sat their mock exams, and they were the worst exams that they had ever sat before. And she sees that there's no other reason for this than the fact that they are dealing with so much stress and anxiety and overwhelm right now. And that she feels like her team and her students are not currently equipped, don't have all the tools and the skills to be able to support them. If we remove COVID from the equation, the stresses and the anxieties still exist. They just look different. They're based upon other unpredictable factors. And so when I think about whether or not we have it right, I think there's a couple of questions. Like, have we identified the need to educate the whole person? Yes. Do we know that there's a value around social and emotional learning and the importance of well-being for teachers and for students? Yes. Have we provided the skills and the tools that educators, even parents, even students need? No. And I think there's a stat that McGraw-Hill did, which said that 93% of teachers, and this was in the United States, believe that social and emotional learning is just as important as academic learning, but only 22% of teachers actually feel equipped. And so there's, for us, a real question around how do we equip educators? How do we equip parents? How do we equip students to be able to manage these uncertainties and to be able to have a greater sense and a greater understanding of who they are, what they love, what's important to them, the decisions that they want to make in their lives, how to manage these anxieties that are showing up for them, and how to find, and I think this is a personal thing for me, how to also find worth beyond academics, how to also find worth beyond that grade that you get. Because my whole worth as a young person was wrapped in the grades that I got and the feedback that I got from my students about, or my friends, whether or not I was cool or not, or pretty enough or good enough.
That's so, I love what you've talked about there, and you're absolutely right. It's such an important part of what it is to be a teacher and to equip young people with those social emotional skills, but they're not seen as important. I was thinking before I go back to Priya, my when I was in primary school, around the time of the Brontosaurus and the Ichthyodon, if there is such a thing. I remember it was the 11 plus, and Melissa Benn in a book, The Truth About Schools. Melissa Benn talks right at the beginning of her book. She talks about 50-year-olds who still feel a sense of not necessarily being as good as they could because of the results that they got in their 11 pluses, and people talking about the career paths that you were saying, Liz, how we divide people up through these rather arbitrary data that happen on a particular day and send them on these pathways, whether it's to be a barrister or a doctor or wherever it is, based on these high stakes tests. Now, Priya, back to your book, and I tell you, I'm not just showing this because you're here. This is genuinely a fabulous book. And the bit that I love about this book is it is a homage to the teacher.
Yeah.
So I've read a lot of educational books. My books, I don't have time to read them all because I'm just buying them like everybody else does. But I just found myself going, yes, she gets it. Yes, you understand. Tell people. You've really looked into what's the lived experience for the teacher. And you said earlier, they don't just leave at 3 o'clock. And there's this lovely part where you talk about it's 30 children in a room and they've got to be educated. And if you've ever had this experience as a parent, Priya, how did you get so immersed into really getting what it was like?
Well, it's over a decade's worth of working in education. So even when I'm not counting this as actually part of the decade at all, but when I was a barrister, I taught in the evenings for a couple of years, and I wrote exams and I marked exams. And actually, one of the reasons that I stopped was that it was just a lot of repeatable work that I just thought wasn't quite what I signed up to do. What I signed up to do was have a real impact on the student. And I was teaching law. It's not necessarily, I can tell you right now, the students weren't as passionate about law as I was. And so it was really challenging. And I had such a diverse range of abilities in front of me. I had a student that I know actually just, would have been fantastic as a practicing barrister in that particular field. And then I had a student who was a resit, and they had failed actually twice before, which was such a shame. And so trying to deal with those two people in one classroom over a short period of time with a curriculum that you had to deliver for this end exam, this big, this horrible, seriously, when you say the word exam, what does it make you feel? Just dread and horror. And, there are some positive things to summative assessment. I'm not saying there are not some positive things to summative assessment, but that all the way to advising FE colleges. I'm really passionate about FE, by the way. So if you don't want to talk about FE, let's not, we should tell me, because I can talk about it all day long. But it's an incredibly important sector that's often quite, really forgotten. And working with FE, all the way then to working with schools for the last 7 years. Now, schools, I've just had the benefit of working very, very closely with thousands of teachers, majority of them in England, but actually many of them also across the globe, going out, seeing them, spending lots of time in the classrooms, spending the lesson with the children, asking lots of questions. I have this annoying habit of asking lots of questions and, getting the answers. And basically, last year, John Catt came to me and said, do you want to write a book? And I thought, first, I generally say yes to everything, which is probably a bit of a mistake. But and I didn't really realise how much work it was to write a book. But it ended up being this really cathartic experience. So I got to put everything down. It was, in a sense, we've had this devastating time of COVID, but so many people have actually understood what it's like to have 1 or 2 children, or maybe 3 at home, maybe 4 or more. But actually, teachers have 30 in the average classroom, 180 in the average year group in a secondary school, 939 in the average in the average whole secondary school, if they're, for example, a subject specialist, that's a lot of kids with a lot of erratic personalities, potentially going through some quite, profound hormonal changes, and they're having to deal with them and actually deliver something at the end of the day. And when we talk about pressure and social and emotional well-being, the answer is no. I'm just not going to put it very lightly here. I'm just going to tell you the honest answer. No, we haven't got it right. And we haven't got it right for both of our children, our learners, but also we haven't got it right for our teachers. And teachers are making a lot of effort. They are working with children. They themselves are trying to cope, but they're doing it in spite of the system, not because of it. And we have to be really clear about that. Nobody is saying that teachers don't do an amazing job. Of course they do. They're heroes. Every teacher deserves a medal. They really, really do. Right. And we used to clap every Thursday, right, for the NHS. We could clap for teachers. Of course we could. But the fact is they're doing it themselves. And they also have other things to deliver. And if we want to go through the statistics about why I think that you can't argue against that point, it's got nothing to do with what Priya thinks and Priya's wins, right? In terms of mental health, 1 in 8 boys between the ages of 5 and 10, that's really young, they meet the criteria for a diagnosable disorder. It's double the rate in girls. Okay, girls, then if you look at 17 to 19-year-olds, 1 in 4 girls meet the criteria for a diagnosable disorder. We're talking about their mental health. Antidepressant prescriptions in the UK doubled between 2006 and 2015. And most of that was between the 15 to 17 age group. The reason I'm giving the ages is these are the ages of children that are in formal education, right? And hospital admissions for girls who are self-harming also doubled between the late 90s and 2017. Now, we might look at that and say, well, why is that? And I'm not going to say that's because of pressure, because I don't know that, right? And I think it's really important we always stick to the data. But those are the figures. Now, if those are the figures of the ones that are being admitted in the diagnosis, then obviously you've got to think, well, how many are not, right? How many people don't put their hands up and say, I've got an issue, I need to talk about it because of potentially the stigma attached, which I think we're doing some really good work on as a society. But if those children are in formal education, and in the book, there's a whole chapter, the book's not about technology, right? There's a whole book called, there's a chapter called The Village. It takes a village to raise a child. Well, if we look at a teacher's job, what does a teacher do? Yes, a teacher delivers a curriculum, a very, very large, bloated curriculum, in my view. But a teacher also is, they act often as, parent, a counsellor. I often talk about, that they're looking after the pastoral care of the child. Now, when a teacher has limited time to deliver the curriculum, they've got limited time to ensure, and every teacher tries to do this, to provide a holistic sort of 360-degree wraparound kind of education. The children have the skills that they will need after they leave school, which we know when we look at the curriculum and say what skills is actually teaching. Many kids do leave school with the right skills, but again, it's in spite of what you have to deliver, not because it's sat down and prescribed by the curriculum. But actually, teachers have so much to deliver. So are we getting it right? No. And when it comes to teachers, a teacher does, on average, they say that a teacher works a 60-hour working week, right? And actually, more teachers would ask to go part-time if they felt that it would be accepted. And it's not necessarily going part-time for their own purposes. It's because they're often feeling quite frazzled. So 7 years ago, 74%, and I'm throwing numbers out, but it's really easy to get this. 3/4 of teachers consider quitting their jobs because they found over the next 3 years, because most of them thought that there was too much workload, right? That number's increased to 82%. Now, if you look at that and you want to argue against it and you say, well, but they haven't. 3/4 of teachers haven't walked out, have they? They haven't done that. But that's not the question that we ought to be asking. It's why do they feel that way? We care about what they feel, don't we? They're looking after our children, right? And so what can we do in terms of lessening that workload? What can we do to ensure that teachers have the care that they need, right? Because they're just as vulnerable, right, as everyone else. And in schools, what are we doing about these numbers of children that are then being admitted and have a diagnosable disorder and are then being treated? Because it's not really a teacher's specialist expertise. It's not their expertise. It's not necessarily their job to have to deal with all of those. And they're concerned about these children. So it often comes down to the very unpopular answer, which is we do need funding. for mental health in schools. We do need extra funding. And I know Treasury is incredibly stretched, particularly with the year that we've had, and everyone always wants more money. But my view is that I think if we did the maths and we found what we'd invest in schools, actually you'd be saving that money from a long-term crisis. And so that maths exercise, that exercise has to be done. And if I'm proven wrong, I'm very, very happy to say, okay, that wasn't the right way forward. But I'd like to see the maths, and I'd like to ensure that somebody's doing it.
Thank you very much, Priya. Just to remind everybody listening in today that they can send in their questions. We're going to have a Q&A at about 10 to 1. So please do keep sending in your questions. And now I'm going to come to Liz. So you've heard pressure, exams, the impact on teachers, the workload. Do you think we're getting it right? And more to add to that list?
Some people are getting some things right. So let's not be too dismal. I think the response we saw through COVID, the creativity unleashed in schools and in teachers and leaders to to deliver education online with 48 hours notice or whatever. That's not to say there wasn't massive variation in practice and experiences, but it was extraordinary for a profession to change its mode of working in such a short time scale. And we've seen, we're really excited. So we've done a piece of work which is called Learning from Lockdown, which is a website about capturing that learning. And as people who, you said our program's about, one of our pieces of work is about creating change makers and disruptors. Well, for people who want change, the entire delivery model being disrupted is quite interesting opportunity for innovation and change and people to come up with new solutions. So, we shouldn't talk down the profession. It's certainly, I wouldn't say it's the profession's fault that some of the things that we're not getting is right. Mm-hmm. I think, the reality is the focus been for the last 15 years in England has been particularly focused on disadvantaged pupils, and the language has been closing the gap, although now I think there's an acceptance that you don't close the gap, so it's now about narrowing the gap. And I totally applaud and support, and I've been part of big national initiatives. Challenge Partners was part of that. Teach First is part of that. Ambition, all the opportunity areas, targeting, saying actually we've got to do something about the gap the appalling gap in outcomes between disadvantaged pupils and their more advantaged peers. And that's a noble and intent, and one I support. So that's something I think we've done right. And pupil premium and funding, there has been funding for that over that period of time. However, which is of course just a posh way of saying but, the fact is, the pressure and some of the negative implications that, I totally agree with what what people have been saying about the implications on mental health, workload, stress, pressure. That comes from fundamentally, for me, a too narrow sense of what school is for. So the purpose of school, this is a provocative way of arguing it, in a way, is to make admission officers at universities' job easier. You could argue that that's the entire purpose of our education schooling system. And so university admissions tutors want grades that are easy to understand, and they want highly academic content in A-levels. So for somebody in circ represented 20% or whatever it is that are going to go to Russell Group or top universities, probably less than that, but whatever the percentage it is, we then have a retrofitted system with heavily academic knowledge based A-levels and GCSEs. Secondary schools, which generally don't have a curriculum, simply have a syllabus. So many secondary schools, the curriculum is just, well, what's the syllabus for GCSE? Drip fed back over 5 years. So you come in year 7 and you sort of start climbing the mountain to your GCSE, that's the only thing that matters. And then it trickles down into primary through SATs and all the rest of it. So that's what creates the pressure, because it's a sort of maniacal monofocus on one set of things that matters, knowledge-based academic learning, at the expense of all else. And the reality is, from our perspective, a big education perspective, we're never going to say that core academic knowledge learning isn't important. Of course it's important. The problem is that it's over-indexed in the current system. So it's valued above all else and at the expense of all else. So Priya, when you then start to talk about we need more money for mental health, and early intervention. I mean, I totally agree with that. And we need a system that doesn't cause the mental health problems in the first place and then needs the funding to intervene to solve it, right? So, you know, children come in, unless they have had really terrible childhood experiences, which that is a reality, but it's a relatively small percentage. You know, just because children are from a disadvantaged background doesn't mean that they can't come to school ready to learn. They may have had disadvantages, but children are unbelievably resilient and their brain elasticity is extraordinary. And they come to school, even if they've had a pretty rubbish time in their formative years, and they want to learn, and schools can do extraordinary things. But if we just value that, you know, so I'll stop in 1 second, but as a way of capturing that, at the end of reception, we have the foundation stage assessment. Now, it has its flaws, but it is a holistic assessment of them as an entire. So when they're 5, we recognise that their physical development, their social and emotional development, you know, is just as important as their early number and their early reading and early literacy skills. They're a whole child when they're 5. The next statutory assessment point is in year 1, where we then value a tiny subset of one of those domains, which is phonics, right? And to me, that is the sort of crux of this transition from valuing them as a whole child to valuing this tiny subset. And our last thing I'll say, the best thing for me about COVID this year was that my daughter, who was in year 1 last year, didn't have to do the phonics screening. I was dancing around the garden, enjoy about that. So anyway.
And Liz, just before
worst test we have in the system. That's my view. Go.
Just before I bring Priya in to follow up around your discussion on exams, and then I want to come to Mackenzie. I know that you're doing a fabulous piece of work, because we had Peter with us at our last on rethinking assessment. And I would recommend that everybody follows on Twitter or tracks down the work that you are doing with Peter Hyman on rethinking assessment, because this is a really brilliant piece of coalescing voices from across the landscape. Now, Priya, I know you'll have some ideas that you'd like to add in when we come back to this piece of exams, and it seems to be this theme of pressure, and then I'll come back to Mackenzie for a slightly different question.
Yeah, sure. So it was really just, I think Liz is absolutely right. And I think Rethinking Assessment is a fantastic group. A really easy website, rethinkingassessment.com. So you can't say that you didn't know where to find it. And you can, if you sign up, actually, what's really great is they are looking for everyone's ideas. And that's a true group, a group that's not just led by one small panel, but they're actually seeking lots of input from everyone. And I've spoken to Peter about it. And there you've got educators from all walks of life, and you've got Lord Baker, who was, you know, frankly came up, you know, supported GCSEs, who's now saying actually we need to rip them down. So that's somebody who's really, you know, looking at the bigger picture. And so absolutely recommend that everyone who's listening, even if it's not live but you're watching a playback, go onto the website, because that's a big piece of work. It's really, really important. On the point of exams, I just want to make, you know, let's just be really clear. So Liz was right to say, why do we have them? And it's really about universities being able to pick the students for them. So when you look at standardized assessment, you know, basically you get all the children, they go into an exam hall, they all take the exam, and they end up with grades. You know, they've got the papers, and what they do is they apply basically a bell curve to it. Right? And so if you take any form of any cohort of students, and they're all, you know, maybe some of them are struggling and they need to do better, and there's all sorts of, you know, it's always a complicated picture. But if you basically apply a bell curve on top of those grades, the idea is that you are failing a third of them no matter what. You know, are we really living in a society where we think that that's okay? Where, you know, we talk to our children about growth mindset, and growth mindset's one of these, you know, contentious things now where people are saying it works, it doesn't work. I mean, for goodness sake, if you tell a child, you know, yeah, you're not just capped with your abilities, you can always do better. I think as a parent, we would, you know, would all pretty much agree that's a good thing. But imagine walking into school today, and we say to every teacher, tell them the truth. When they walk into school, say, when you do your exams, a third of you are going to fail just because that's the system. I think that absolutely sucks. I mean, there's no other nicer way of saying it, but that's the truth. And that system shouldn't exist. We have to replace the exam system. We have to remove high stakes assessment. The Secretary of State who decides that he or she will not sign up to PISA, there'll be statues of that Secretary of State in every school with garlands on it, I promise you. Because the idea that we have and operate a system in this country where we are measuring a very narrow set of metrics is absolutely ludicrous. We know that we want that holistic system. So we care about knowledge, we care about foundation knowledge, we care about skills. There are some things about the phonics check that I do think are really valuable. I mean, knowing that children can actually, it's about getting past that stage, right? Because there were too many children who, for example, would go through primary and not necessarily have the basics and the foundations right. But actually, I've got a part in the book where I've got the graph of the phonics check. So when Liz was talking, I was laughing because there's a graph where when DFE told you what the pass mark of the phonics check was, it was unbelievable how many schools managed to just literally get the majority of their children to pass that threshold. So the idea is whatever we're measuring, we have to be very, very careful about. Because when you measure things, and it's public knowledge, you're measuring certain metrics, those then tend to be the guiding star for that entire sector, right? And so, you know, it's really, really important we get that right. Now, when you look at PISA tables and we look at international rankings for the country and how every Secretary of State wants to essentially be, you know, get better and better on PISA, everyone wants to beat Estonia or beat Finland, right? And the idea, or Singapore, well, okay, if that's what their guiding star is that the right guiding star, right? And then if you then come down to the EBAC and you say, okay, well, we're heavily weighting maths and English and then the sciences, but, you know, drama and PE and actually the subjects that teach you collaborative work, leadership, thinking outside the box, all of those kind of skills that, you know, Tata, Pearson, all these big companies are saying those are the skills that we really value, right? Critical thinking, all of these things. Then actually we have to start to question, well, why is the system the way it is? And so, you know, it kind of comes down to the fundamental question of this session, which is, what does this gift look like? And is it fit for purpose? What I think people need to really be honest with themselves and go back and say, what is the purpose of education? Now, most parents will say it's not just to get entry into, you know, I'm not just looking at entry to a university, but I do know plenty of parents, particularly in northwest London where I live, who are really competitive, and from the second they find out they're pregnant, they're working themselves backwards from Oxbridge in terms of which nursery they should enroll their child in. There are parents who will think that way, but that's not necessarily right. So what do we actually want for our children? What is education for? You know, I argue it's for opportunity and choice for whatever exists. You know, when we get into 2030, 2040, what will they need? They'll need to be able to learn how to learn, which I think is a really big deal, because no matter how much the world changes, if you have to constantly spoon feed every single child education in a prescriptive way, when they become adults and the world changes, they don't know where to go and what to do, right? And we need to create these resilient learners who love learning, who love finding resources and solving the problem for themselves, right? And so the exam system absolutely doesn't cater to that. So I think I just wanted to amplify what Liz was saying. So go through that bell curve, why we basically fail a third of our kids. None of us want to do that, right? That's not right. And the fact that the entire system does need a rethink, but it's going to take someone really brave to do it, because people say, well, we don't want risk and we don't want change, especially at the moment. Well, why not? COVID has disrupted everything. Here is the time, now is the time to change things. And in 12 to 18 months, once that vaccine, I mean, what amazing news about the vaccine. I thought that was incredible. And the fact that we managed to get hold of that many doses and they've approved it, that's amazing. That's a testament to what Brits can do, right? And that's brilliant. But the fact is that in 12 to 18 months, when this thing settles down, is anybody going to be up for change again? Because I think the answer will probably be no. So we really, really do need to maintain the momentum of, okay, this disruption has not been good. It's been devastating. But what can we now do? What lessons can we learn? And how can we make things better?
So I'm going to ask that. Thank you very much. I'm going to ask that question now to Mackenzie. And the area that I'm particularly interested in is, what can we now do? Because I wanted to just start, before we go to questions, I wanted to now start to move more into the future. Priya, you've given us a flavour of the type of transferable skills that young people need to have. But what are we going to do with our teachers to keep them in the profession, our students to feel that they have a sense of purpose and they have this agency over their own lives? Graydon, you're the co-founder of that. This is exactly the space that you work in. For the gift for the future, how will you support our young people and our teachers? And that's for you, Mackenzie.
Okay. So there's a lot of points that have been made about how to support. I, of course, have a view around the work that we do and the impact that it makes. We need parents and educators, specifically educators, to feel empowered and to feel supported and to feel informed, to be able to help themselves, help their colleagues, and also to be able to help their students. And I think that teachers are at the front line, like we've been talking about, and they have 101 different things that they are doing all of the time. And they need, I think there's 3 words that always come to mind for me. They need to be supported, they need to be empowered, like I said, and they need to be connected. They need to be able to have skills and tools to be able to flourish within their communities, to be able to support each other, to be able to motivate and empower each other. And so the work that we do in schools is bringing coaching into education and specifically equipping teachers in that way. And coaching has a lot of different, definitions, but ultimately it's a very transformative set of tools and strategies and skills that help to unlock a person's natural abilities. And by doing that, what that means is that not every teacher is going to want to use coaching skills, full stop. Of course not. But even if we had 50% more teachers that learned some skills to be able to support them, have those really difficult conversations with students, or be able to equip themselves so that they can manage the stresses and the overwhelming feeling that they face on a daily basis, or have conversations with parents that are really challenging and really trying. If they are able to have additional skills and tools out of that they can pull out of their toolkit on a day-to-day basis, right? Where they have to end up playing the role of both a teacher and a mentor and a safeguarder and a consultant and a coach. If they can have that additional toolkit, our experience has been that they feel more prepared and more able to support their students. And
just before we go to questions.
Ray, can I just
Yeah,
Ray, can I just quickly, before we just go to questions, can I just say that, Mackenzie made such an important point on teacher retention. Just remember that the data says the longer you stay in teaching, the less likely you are to leave. COVID has created a massive interest in teaching. So we've had more applications, and actually we're going to have more trainee teachers next year than before in a good way. That's positive. The challenge now is, how do we keep them? How do we stop them getting that 3-year and 4-year itch of leaving, right? Or 2 years of being frazzled. This period now, the next 5 years, is going to be absolutely critical to retain them, because then we know if they stay over, let's say 5, 6, 7 years, then they're not going to leave. And that's, there is an opportunity right now. And I just want to see that something changes in terms of the well-being of our teachers and even the paying of our teachers, even though as tough as that is, but something needs to change to ensure that whole new intake feels like that this is a profession that's for them and it's not a short-term thing.
Yeah, really important. And I'm, in terms of how schools will be resourced, I am, as a head teacher that has to constantly manage drip feeding of amounts of money for pupil premium, sports premium, whatever it is, catch-up funding, where we are working on the principle that every child, it's certainly in Cambridgeshire, is £3,700 per child, which is not very much money at all. If we double that, I would love to see classes of about 15 children in a class where the teacher really got to know that child, was really able to support that child. That would be the type of funding I genuinely, and the real change I'd like to see. Liz, before we go to questions, what are we going to change for the future? We've had some lovely ideas about looking after our teachers now. And obviously the work of Century does some great work around workload. What else can we do for the future? And then we'll go to questions.
A few quick points. I think one thing as a sector we can do, as policymakers we should do, and as leaders in our schools we should do, is take note of the side effects of interventions that we make. So children are extraordinary, and you can sit them down in a room and pump them through it full of a load of knowledge and get them to sit down and shut up and listen. They'll do that because social compliance and their brains are amazing. But what's the effect of that? So what's the effect of not attending properly to a more holistic, what we talk about, the head, the heart, and the hand? So to your point, Graydon, what's the consequence of us having a narrowed curriculum, right? So we should be more attentive. Education constantly gets compared to the evidence-based practice of medicine. But in medicine, they attend to the side effects. What are the other implications of this? Not just, oh, look, it increases SATs results. Yeah, well, what else does it do? Okay, so that's one thing I think we could all do with. The second thing, and just building again on your point, Graydon, about empowerment. Yeah, Tim Brighouse talks about find the gaps in the hedges. So to me, that's about empowerment, and that's true of teachers and it's true of leaders. So where can you make it? Where can you do something different? There's actually masses of autonomy in our school system, more than probably any jurisdiction in the world. It's incredibly devolved. So we have masses of autonomy, but then we have very, very high stakes accountability. So you can do things your own way, but you're massively accountable for the outcomes. It's right that school leaders and teachers are accountable for the outcomes. But the third point is we should reduce the stakes. In a sense, broaden the discussion about what schools are accountable for, but reduce the stakes to make it a more honest, open and trusting. And the very last thing I'd say is that for all of us as school leaders, and when you're talking about teacher workload, so much of that is defined by the leaders in schools. If teachers make the weather in the classroom, leaders make the weather in the staff room. And that's a huge driver of whether staff feel supported and well in their workplace. So leaders have got to look in the mirror about the extent to which they're passing on some of the pressure in kind of slightly mono-focused ways. And the very last point I'd make is about risk. So Priya, I totally agree with that. How do we think about and quantify risk? People feel that making change in education is too risky because kids only get one chance. But to go back to your point about the norm reference GCSEs, every single year we are failing, or we are complicit in the failure of a third of kids. And that's a very, very important thing for us to all look in the mirror about as middle class professional parents or whoever we are in society. But we don't lean in to face that truth, because we know, or we expect, that we will make sure our own kids are not in that bottom third. And we are all complicit in that. So we should lean into the reality of the system with which we are all complicit.
Wonderful, and lovely to end with such passion and potentially a call to arms. Ellen, have we had some questions?
We have indeed. I'm going to have to shorten this question a little bit from Sue Wheat, but essentially lots of schools are now getting involved in climate action, which is incredible. But people working in schools who are also working on climate action know that teachers and head teachers are already overwhelmed with day-to-day activities. How can we support how can we support schools and teachers in this really important work, educating about something that is impacting everyone right now and will go on to have a future impact? Does anyone have any thoughts on incorporating climate action into the curriculum and in schools?
I mean, I think we need a whole curriculum change. I mean, the fact that kids are talking about it and teachers are having to basically talk about it and actually probably want to talk about it because it affects all of us. It affects our kids, the grandkids and everyone else in the future. Just goes to show, actually, it's not, yes, the teachers have got to deal with the problem again, haven't they? They've got a dilemma where they don't have enough time. But the fact is that's relevant. This is relevant. This is what should be in the curriculum. Financial literacy should be in the curriculum. Digital, we talk about digital skills and everyone sort of veers towards coding, AI, blockchain. What are these things? These could be taught at primary level actually in a really simple way as an extension to how to apply mathematics or parts of the sciences. The point is that the fact that we've even got that question just demonstrates that the curriculum that we have today is it's been added to and added to and added to over the years. It's huge. It's 80,000 words, and it's the size of The Hobbit, right? And that is just not feasible. It's not practical to deliver that in a short period of time with so many children. The reason people talk about Estonia doing so well, it's got a very small curriculum compared to ours, right? It's about a third of the size, right? So there's not as much pressure to deliver so much. So the curriculum doesn't just need to be shortened, it needs to be made more relevant. We need to start adding and talking about climate change. The problem is, don't just add, because then you're just guilty of the same problem that we've had over the last decade. We have to have an entire sort of rethink about the curriculum and think about all of these very important issues. And shouldn't we want our children to be educated about these sorts of issues? Because I know teachers are doing it, again, in spite of what the curriculum is about. So all of this work needs to happen, and it's going to be a brave group that does it at DFE, I suspect, if it's curriculum based. But it's going to have to happen. That's the change. And if not, lesson plans, anything you can find online, anything you can maybe send home, maybe projects that kids could do with their parents to get their parents a little bit more engaged. Not all parents are engaged, obviously, or guardians with their child's education, but things, that you could offer them where you can replicate the work rather than try and do it yourself would probably be a good idea.
Yeah, and it's not just climate change as well that isn't on the curriculum. We don't even have Black history in the curriculum. There's so many areas. I wasn't educated that long ago, and I never learned about colonialism and all these really big, important topics that just somehow get neglected, even through 18 years of education. So I think you're right. There's something there about continuing to kind of maybe like reviewing how the system works and how
a relevance lens, someone who can look at the curriculum with a relevance lens, because that's a different lens. It's not saying that what's there isn't important or is, but long division clearly doesn't need to happen in mathematics. Why is that even? Why are people spending 4 weeks teaching that? We don't need to learn long division. There are parts of maths that are obviously really fundamental and important, but a relevance lens, would be really, really great. A panel of people to look at it in that way. Sorry.
It's interesting, Priya, because actually in terms of freedoms, actually, academies don't have to teach the national curriculum. And, so that's at least, whatever, it's more than half schools, more than like 80-90% of secondary schools. So is it a curriculum problem? I would say it's actually, it's an assessment qualification problem, and what you're tested on.
Well, that's it.
Because at a primary level,
you've got the alignment.
Yeah. I mean, so I totally agree with you about the relevance point. But I think, as a parent, what you could do is go and just hassle your school a bit in a nice way, or go with some ideas and say, I think it'd be really great if we did some more work on this, or could we start a club, or could we, because actually you can teach it through literacy, you can teach it through, you can teach these things in a cross-curricular way, and there's actually nothing stopping certainly academies, because they have to even teach national curriculum.
But you've hit the nail on the head. So the first thing is, if it's not necessarily aligned with what you might see in a test at the end of the day, then that's going to challenge as to what the incentive is to teach it. And the second thing is time. It's just time. The fact teachers, to get the time to think, if I plan this lesson, because they plan, right? They spend their weekends and their evenings planning. Let's not joke about this. That's what teachers do. Long summer holidays, please, right? How many of them are sitting there in August while other people are on the beach? And they are planning lessons. That's what they do. For them to plan that, I think people do find, there are private schools, independent schools that follow the national curriculum, and there's definitely no need for them to follow it either. But they do, because it's there, it's a framework, it's a guide, it makes life a little bit easier. So there is a responsibility, I think, to look at it and to say, well, how can we make this more relevant? There's certainly no point in having an irrelevant national curriculum for no matter who wants to follow it or not. But I think that big investment, that piece of work definitely needs to happen.
I think the challenges that educators face is that there are particular biographical tendencies within how curricula are created. And so, as we know, the previous Secretary of State who launched this one had a particular interest in history. And so with 18 months between each Secretary of State for Education, we're always constantly on this pendulum swing of having to go along with what's required, because ultimately it is statutory and it is the law. Ellen, any more questions?
No, and I thought I'd just add to that a lot of people don't realise that Secretary of State for Education often doesn't have an education background. So essentially they're put in charge of something that they don't necessarily have an expertise in, which it would be like putting me in charge of all the finances when I don't really understand taxes. It just doesn't make any sense. And I grew up under Michael Gove, as Secretary of State for Education, and saw this huge overhaul of education, but for very little point and with very little relevancy to what I was learning. So it's very interesting. Yeah, the idea of a relevancy lens, I think, is something we should all take forward. I'm actually going to wrap up, but before I do, I just wanted to say absolutely huge thank you to Ray for hosting, and to Priya, Mackenzie and Liz for being our guests. If you have enjoyed this video, please make sure you share it and share this talk widely with people in education, people who have young people in their care, people who just are interested in making the world a better place. At Smiley Movement, we're really committed to making sure that everybody is able to get involved and help and support and build a better society in any way they can, wherever they are from. Make sure you follow us on all our social media, and to find out more about us, head to smileymovement.org.